Hello Lavecon 2021 and welcome to this prestigious location, my spare room, the place where the British Science Fiction Association Awards have been hosted in 2021 and in 2020. We're doing the author readings now and we have 4 strong stories for you this evening. We're going to be hearing readings from Emily Inkpen, from Tej Turner, from Kevin Elliott and from myself. I'm reading from the sequel to my 2020 novel, Fearless. I'm going to be reading a chapter from Resilient, which is due out in 2022. These are a short selection of work from each of the authors, and hopefully they'll encourage you to go and check out their work elsewhere and to see what they're up to after Lavecon's finished. Anyway, over to our first reader this evening, Emily Inkpen. She's going to be reading from The Dark, a short story prequel to her Dex Legacy series, which is available as partially an audio drama and will also soon be available as a series of novels. Over to you, Emily.
The Dark, a prequel to the Dex Legacy audio drama series. Ren had always liked the dark, and after 2 weeks of fighting in the Dominos Mountains, he liked it even more. The daylight here was obnoxiously bright. Every time he stepped outside, his mechanical irises reached their internal shade limit, and he was forced to squint painfully. Dark glasses or goggles were a must, but even they had their drawbacks. The earth was brown and powdery, and so were the rocks. In battle, every hit threw clouds of thick dust into the air that choked and blinded and coated everything. Any eye protection constantly needed wiping, and visibility was poor most of the time. They'd taken to fighting in the early morning or at dusk to avoid the sun, which helped. Even if it put them on the same schedule as the Dominossi rebel factions they were meant to be subduing. That morning, they'd intercepted a supply train heading up into the caves where the rebels were based. He and his adopted siblings, Varian and Isra, had taken care of it on their own. There had been no need for anyone else. It was more heavily guarded than they thought it would be, but that hadn't been a problem. The Dominossi were more dangerous at a distance than they were up close. Their snipers were deadly, but their tactics relied on taking a shot and retreating, reappearing from a different tunnel and taking another shot. As soon as they were pinned down, their advantage disappeared. He, Varian and Isra had been adopted as babies from 3 different countries, genetically rebuilt from infancy and trained to kill. They had no problem taking the fight to the rebels. Isra stirred in the bunk next to him. He felt her naked skin on his own and stretched luxuriously. "How long have we been gone?" she murmured into his shoulder. "Almost an hour." She swore quietly and sat up. After returning to camp, they'd gone to shower the dust off themselves and got distracted before they could get dressed. It was becoming a habit that Ren had no intention of giving up. There was no light in the cabin except for the greenish glow from various electronic dials, and against one of these she was outlined in sharp relief. He ran a pale finger up her brown spine and she wriggled. Her back was crossed with scars of all shades, some old from childhood and some more recent. She stretched and her threaded shoulder muscles rippled pleasantly. "He's going to work it out," she said, swinging herself over him and gathering her clothes from around the transport cabin. Ren sat up. "Who, Varian?" "He knows us too well," she said uneasily. "But he's not expecting it," Ren pointed out. "Trust me, a week ago he was giving me advice on how to get girls." Isra pulled her sand-coloured military trousers over her brown legs. "Well, mission accomplished." "You're not girls." She straightened up, pulling her t-shirt over her head, and looked at him incredulously through the gloom. "I'm definitely a girl." "But you're not just girls. Random." She raised an eyebrow. "If this is going to carry on, we need to tell him." "Unless you don't want it to." Ren grinned. She wasn't going to get him with reverse psychology. "I want to carry on, I just don't want to tell him yet. Why are you in such a hurry?" Isra folded her arms. "He's our brother. We've never kept anything from him before." Ren honestly didn't have a response to that. He got up and pulled his trousers on. His legs looked ghostly pale in the greenish light. "We should tell him," Isra concluded. Ren groaned. "He's going to kill me." "He'll kill both of us," Isra said. "Or he'll try, but he's never been able to take us both down." "No, that's your speciality," Ren said, and she grinned. "It's not my fault you're both slow." "I'm serious, Isra. He's going to hate me for touching you. You're his sister. And you're his brother," she said. "Have you ever thought about that? You're my little brother." "By 3 months," Ren interjected, "and he already thinks I'm a bad influence on you." He pulled his t-shirt over his head. "You are." She aimed a punch at his chest, which he blocked lazily. "Why aren't you taking this seriously?" Ren groaned and shrugged. "What if I died tomorrow? We're fighting a real war here, Isra. I don't want to spend my last day alive trying to explain this to Varian." "It's not a real war. It's subduing a rebel group on behalf of the Oscillian government." "A rebel group who occupy a range of mountains bigger than some countries," Ren corrected her. "Some would call that an invasion." Isra shrugged. "So we're invading. And they're fighting back. Ask any of these Dominossi rebels and I'm pretty sure they'd say they're at war." Isra's eyes flashed through the gloom. "Why does it matter? Our orders are to subdue. We're out here with 50 soldiers each. That's only 153 soldiers total. That's not a war." "Even if that were true, you, me and Varian are worth how many soldiers?" Ren said. 50 each? 100? Isra shrugged. "I don't know. A lot, I guess." "Unless we die tomorrow." "Unless we die tomorrow," Ren repeated. She leaned forward and kissed him, running her hand up around his neck and threading her fingers into the hair at the back of his head. Being with her felt right in every conceivable way. He'd just not worked out how to put that feeling into words. In the past few weeks, everything had changed between them. And as soon as Varian knew, it might all change again. "Do you even know what you'd say to him?" Ren asked. Isra shrugged. "Not really." "Okay, imagine I'm Varian," Ren said, sitting down on the edge of his bunk and making his knee jerk up and down like Varian's did when he was nervous about something. "Tell me." Isra pulled a face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, say what's going on between us in a way that won't make Varian want to punch either of us in the face. Go." She opened and closed her mouth a few times without saying anything. "We're not related," she said finally. "Not really." "I know," Ren said. He'd been repeatedly finding his way around that question since it all started. Yes, they'd been raised together, but they were adopted and their home countries hadn't even been close. Isra was his sister. That hadn't changed, but they weren't related by blood. It was the one missing link that had made room for this. He'd always loved her, but for more than a year his feelings had been changing. Until a few weeks ago he thought it was just him, and he'd been half expecting to wake up from the dream ever since. "Let's wait another week," he said. She slid onto his lap and he wrapped his arms around her, gazing into her bright blue eyes. The filament in her mechanical irises reflected the dim greenish light and glittered menacingly. His and Varian's were the same, an unforeseen side effect of some of the genetic treatments fed into them over the years. One round had triggered ocular albinism, blinding them for more than a year. Devek, the doctor in charge of their development, had created their irises to fix the problem, and it had worked. When they could see again, their eyes were the same icy blue, and for the first time they had a physical characteristic in common. Visually, everything else about them was different, even down to the colour of their skin. Varian was shorter than Ren by several inches now, with dark skin and thick black hair. He was strong as iron, with wide shoulders and thick arms. Isra's hair was also black, but smooth and sleek when it wasn't messy from battle. She would never be as strong as Varian, but she was quick and deadly and more than a match for him. Ren's white pale skin and blonde hair marked him as the odd one out. He was somewhere between Varian and Isra in speed, but longer in the legs, which he used whenever he could. They were so different, but had shared absolutely everything. "What are we going to do?" Isra asked quietly. "No idea," Ren replied, grinning at her. "Die tomorrow?" She laughed and stood up. "Come on, let's assume we'll survive and go and find our big brother." Ren rolled his eyes, grabbed his dark glasses and followed her out of the cabin. In the early afternoon the light came from everywhere at once. The filter over his irises darkened as the mechanism whirred, trying to find a comfortable position. There was none. He put his glasses on and kicked at the dust irritably. The sooner they were done with this war, the better. Isra had already gone. She was skirting the camp and would spend 5 minutes with her unit before showing up at the transport they'd converted into mission control. Ren went straight there. It was well lit, but it felt comfortably dark compared to outside. Varian glanced up as he walked in. I heard from our father. Wren pulled a face. Why do you call him that? Because legally that's what he is, Varian said. The great and glorious Nathaniel Dex. We need to make faster progress. Our clients growing impatient. Their clients were the collected chancellors of Osgil, and Wren rolled his eyes. The Dominossi were never a threat before Osgil tried to force their ideals on them. Before that, there were a few small rebel communities scattered through the mountains. They only became a problem after Osgil tried to wipe them out. More joined their ranks to fight oppression. Now they're united against the one enemy and collected in strongholds. It's Osgil's fault, and it will take as long as it takes. Varian raised his eyebrows. I know that. But that's why Osgil hired the Dex military in the first place. Their own army caused this mess, and we're here to clean it up. Without their idiocy, we'd be back on the training quad or in the lab. And honestly, I'm glad we're here instead. Wren grinned and sat down. Agreed. We're away from Devik's experiments. We're in charge of our troops, and we're proving ourselves. Varian tapped a control panel on the table, and a 3-dimensional map of the mountain appeared. You up for some more fun later? What kind of fun? The kind that means no more supply trains ever for our friends in the mountains. Wren nodded. Good idea. Tonight? Dusk, Varian replied, as Isra walked in. The plan was simple. They would break the coils in the rail. The single rail along which the train ran was full of circuits that enabled electromagnetic propulsion. They had to get inside and dismantle the coils. It was dangerous. The line wrapped around the mountains, running high over ravines and sheer cliffs. They left the camp late, and by the time they were in position, it was almost dark. The Dominos Mountains may have been hell during the day, but they made up for it at night. Blazing sunsets melted like gold against the reddish-brown horizon, and almost immediately afterwards the sky would fade to black, streaked with inky purple where the spiral arm of the galaxy glowed overhead. The temperature plummeted quickly as soon as the first stars became visible, and Wren shuddered in the fresh chill on the air. They were about to cross a narrow support beam onto the rail, and he scanned the shadowy rocks across the ravine. Everywhere they went, he could feel eyes. They're watching, Isra said quietly. Who? Varian replied. The rebels. Varian snorted. They don't have our eyes, Isra. They can't see anything. Can't see anything of you, perhaps, Wren muttered. They were dressed in black for the operation, but Wren had worn long sleeves over his pale arms and wrapped a dark scarf over his white blonde hair. Varian and Isra didn't have it so bad. Wren glanced at Isra, who grinned back at him before turning to their brother. They're sure to be protecting this line, Varian, she murmured. Then stay quiet, Varian said irritably. Isra shook her head. We can't shine any lights or make any sparks. Nothing that could mark a target. Wasn't planning on it anyway, Varian muttered. Wren shrugged and stepped out over the void. The sooner it was done, the sooner they could go home, and he could think of more than one way to get warm again. He set off northwards along the rail, aware of Isra and Varian following behind. A breeze whipped up from below. It brought hot, dusty air from the sun-warmed rocks in the ravine, and he only just managed not to cough. Sound carried in this place, and darkness amplified it. Like all senses came alive as soon as the glare of the sun stopped smothering them. A soft tap vibrated along the track, and he knew Varian had decided they should stop. Wren crouched down and reached past the lip of the rail to the smooth panels enclosing the mechanism. The edges were crusted with thick grime, and he followed one, moving crab-like along the narrow surface. There would be a vertical join somewhere with a latch. The panels were long, and he followed the rail as it curved gently around an outcrop. Eventually, he felt a corner and paused, running his finger down the join. He was completely absorbed in his task when another breeze stirred from below. He steadied himself to wait for it to pass. The last thing he wanted was for the panel to come away, get caught in the wind, and go clattering noisily into the depths. He glanced up and froze. Another face was staring back at him from a fissure in the rock he'd not even noticed. A male rebel face. They looked at each other in mutual shock for what seemed like an eternity. Then he moved and Wren straightened up. The rebel struck out with a long metal rod, and Wren dodged quickly. He didn't want to make a noise. If there was one here, there would be more, but there was a chance the rest hadn't been alerted. He dodged another strike, grabbed the end of the pole and pulled. The rebel lost his footing and let out a shriek as he fell into the darkness below. Ren let go of the pole, but he hadn't meant to. He shook his arm, which was rapidly going numb. The feeling seemed to be spreading, and he staggered back a few steps along the rail. Whatever that thing had done, it wasn't good, and he could feel the sensation creeping up his neck. He was about to turn when a shape fell from above, and everything went dark.
Our next reading is from Tej Turner. He's going to be reading from his epic fantasy novel Bloodsworn, published by Elsewhere Press. Tej is a prolific writer. He has other books out like Dionysius Rises and the Janus Cycle, all published by Elsewhere Press.
Hello, my name is Tej Turner. I am going to be reading from Bloodsworn, which is my third and most recent novel published by Elsewhere Press. This is the first book of a new epic fantasy series called The Avatars of Ruin. The part of the book I am going to be reading from does contain some light spoilers, but it's a good representation of its premise. It's during the point of the story where the main characters have just escaped from being ritually experimented from. Some of them are covered in mysterious scars and they have new powers they don't quite understand, and they're on the run from monstrous shape-shifting creatures called Zakaras who massacred their village. And I'm going to be reading from the character called Jaden, because there's several different point of view characters in this book. So, I will begin now. While Jaden treated Kyra's wounds, she barely seemed to notice his presence. She just sat with a haunted expression. The only movement she made was the occasional shudder. Jaden applied a salve of herbs. It would help heal her arm and stop it from becoming infected, but he knew her arm would most likely scar. There was nothing he could do about that. He wrapped a bandage around it, and while he did it, he thought about what Kyra had just done, the implications. Kyra had just made a blood oath. Everyone from Jallard knew what a blood oath was. Legendary characters and tales they were told as children often made such pacts with the gods. By drawing one's own blood while speaking a vow, people became blood-sworn. And in every tale where the oath was broken, the ending was always the same. The blood-sworn died. Most of the other villagers probably thought blood oaths nothing more than a myth, but they feared it just enough to never try it. Jaden had never known anyone to make the pact before, so he wasn't sure how much truth there was to the legends. But one thing Jaden did know was that his mother, Meredith, had sternly warned him against ever making a blood oath. And Jaden's mother had always been rather scathing about the petty superstitions many of the villagers had. Once Jaden finished tending to Kyra, he rubbed her shoulder for a while to comfort her, but she ignored him. Jaden looked around him. Most of the others were in a similar state to Kyra. They sat quietly. They didn't even look at each other. None of them spoke. There were no appropriate words for what they had just experienced. Sidri, in particular, was in such a sorry state it seemed he was dead to the world. He just stared up at the sky. Only the weak expanding and contracting of his chest was reassurance that he still breathed. Jaden only felt a vague sense of despair. He was strangely numb to emotion. Nothing that happened seemed real to him yet. It had not quite sunk in. When Bard finished building a fire, he asked Jaden to brew a potion which would help them sleep. Jaden obeyed silently, opening the bag his mother packed for him and searching for some Garenwort. When he found it, he crawled over to the fire and brewed the concoction. Bard had already suspended a pot of water over the flames. Once it was finished, Bard made each of them drink the mixture. None of them had the strength to argue. Some of them did not even have the will to hold the cup to their lips, but Bard did it for them. They were all forced to drink. Jaden woke a bit earlier than the others, while the sun was still rising. He was confused for a while when he saw all the others sprawled out on the grass nearby, but then, with a sinking heart, he remembered the events of the previous day. He got up and walked down the hill. He wanted to be alone. He sat and stared out into the distance, thinking about everything that had just happened. It still didn't feel real to him. He reached into his pocket for the last remaining slither of a tunic he had used to make bandages the night before and placed it on his forehead so that it covered the scar. He tucked the other two ends of it underneath his long curtains of hair and tied it around the back. It was a simple thing, but it felt cathartic. It marked a transition in his life. He had a terrible feeling he had not seen the last of Shayam or the Sakaras, and he didn't want people to see the scar or the crystal if he was ever forced to use its powers again. When he had finished tying the second knot, Jaden noticed a dark shape below him, crawling up the hill. He looked down, his eyes focusing. Jaden gasped when he recognised who it was. He leapt to his feet. When he reached her, she collapsed into his arms and caught her breath. "I told you I would find you, Jaden," she whispered into his ear as they embraced. "We are connected." Jaden stared at her, barely believing his eyes. It was Bryna. That was the end of chapter 9. But I'm going to read a bit from chapter 10 as well. Character change point of view here, so it's now going to be from the perspective of Bard, who is out of the people who escaped from the village, the survivors. He's the eldest one, and he's a former soldier, so he's the mentor to the rest of them. "Jaden, get away from her!" Bard exclaimed when he saw them. The twins jumped at the sound of his voice and looked up at him like a pair of terrified mice. "Why?" Jaden asked. "Jaden," Bard repeated, adopting a sterner tone of voice. "Step away from her now." It was an order, and it had taken years of leadership for Bard to perfect that tone. It was rare if someone had the gall to disobey it, but the blind love for the thing Jaden seemed convinced was his sister prevailed, and he held on to her. Bard considered his next action carefully. A few days ago, he would not have cared greatly about Jaden's life, for he had always been a feeble, useless boy. Jaden had heard from the mouths of others that Jaden was intelligent. I think that was actually Bard had heard from the mouths of others that Jaden was intelligent. How else would he have been chosen for the academy? And there was a certain kind of intelligence Bard appreciated because it made better warriors. But Jaden's acumen was not of any form useful in the field, and he had never shown any interest in the arts of combat. Jaden had always been a hindrance to him. Bard strived to achieve his challenges, and if he was set a task, he met it with precision. His task in Jalad was to mould its youths into the most apt warriors possible, and one feeble young man who barely had the strength to hold a sword, let alone wield it, was to him a failure. But after seeing what Jaden could do yesterday, this feeble young man held new value. Bard had just spent the entire night considering the odds of their survival if they were attacked again, premeditating the likelihood of them all reaching Shemet with shame and pursuit. He even pondered a rough calculation of how Sharma's defences would fare against a Gavendarian invasion aided by Sakaras, and Shemet defending itself from an army of those beasts crossing over the northern border. Many scenarios ran through his mind, and in all of them, this feeble young man from Jalad, his failure, held a crucial role. The bitter irony vexed him. Why couldn't the stone of Zakar have been fused to Revan or someone else more worthy? What kind of sick joke were the gods playing on the world? "She's my sister," Jaden said. "We don't know that yet," Bard said. Bard studied the girl. She resembled Bryna, but Bard analysed her every detail, searching for any which would indicate she was no longer human. She had not done anything suspicious so far. She hadn't spoken a word, but she had always been a quiet girl. She was the stranger half of Jalad's outlandish twins. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her black hair had a peculiar purple hue which matched the unique colour of her eyes. She had a haunted expression on her face, but that was no different to the other people around him who had survived yesterday's horror. None of them were ready to face the world yet. The things they had seen were too harrowing. It was too bad they had no choice. Bard felt some remorse for what had just happened, but it was numbed. He wasn't from Jalad. He had never come to think of it as home. His experiences during the War of Ashes hardened him. He had witnessed comrades die, civilians slaughtered. He had seen villages burnt to their very foundations. Bard had not just lost his entire family like these kids had. Bard had never even had a family, so the idea of it was somewhat alien to him. He was an orphan, raised within the academy itself, and it had therefore never been instilled into his nature to get too attached to people. He felt a sense of loss over the fate which befell the village in which he had dwelt for the last 10 years, but Bard learnt long ago to deal with grief by concentrating on his goals. He was no longer teaching youngsters to wield swords, they were fighting for survival, and, unless Bard stayed focused, they would be the next to die. He wasn't going to let that happen. Kyra appeared, next to Bard. "Bryna?" she whispered in disbelief. Bard turned to Kyra in surprise. It was the first time her lips had uttered a single word since she made that blood oath the previous day. "Stay back, Kyra," Bard said, blocking her path. She might be one of them. Bard got no joy out of crushing Kyra's newfound sense of hope, but he needed to put her safety first. Kyra seemed to listen to him. She stopped and eyed Bryna suspiciously. This was good news to Bard. It seemed Kyra's sense of reason was not completely lost. "She's not," Jaden said. "We can't be sure, Jaden," Bard said. "I know she isn't," Bard replied. He pointed to his forehead. "I can sense Zakaras, and she isn't one of them." Bard considered this. He had no idea how Jaden's new powers worked. He had only seen their application for the first time a day ago. Could the boy really sense them, as well as control them? "What about yesterday?" Bard realised, feeling a wave of fury. "Why didn't you warn us?" "I didn't know how to back then," Jaden mumbled, his voice laden with much regret. "How can you be sure now?" Bard asked. "Stop it," Jaden cried. "I just know." Bard turned his eyes back to the young woman next to Jaden. She had still not spoken for herself. If she was a Zakara, she could have killed him by now, Bard realised. But that could just be a ruse, a plot to gain our trust so it can maximise the damage to the whole group. Bard pondered whether he should trust Jaden. The young man had always been cowardly, so it seemed very plausible he could be convincing himself that that thing was his real sister because he couldn't bear to accept a grim truth. "How did you survive, Bryna?" Bard said, shifting his focus back to her. Bryna met his gaze, but then turned away. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came. "I will ask again," Bard said, adopting a sterner tone. "How did you survive the attack on the village, Bryna?" She turned her eyes down to her feet. "Leave her alone," Jaden put an arm around her. "Can't you see she's been through enough?" But she might be a Sakara, Bard thought. What were the chances that the one survivor of a massacre was this cowering young woman before him? Bard had heard that she was blessed, but was she really strong enough to outstand Zakara's? "Bryna?" Kyra whispered. "Is that really you?" Kyra walked to Bryna. This time Bard didn't stop her, but he watched warily as the two friends reunited. They shared a warm embrace. What else could Bard do? He could scarcely send Bryna away into the wilderness just because of his suspicions. Jaden had personally vouched for her. As moments passed and nothing of alarm occurred, Bard relaxed a little. "So, we have another survivor," he mused, and his mind began to ponder the ramifications of this. Kyra and Jaden both had new light in their eyes. Bard realised this turn of events was good for morale. To them, Bryna's survival was a glimmer of hope they had found in the darkness. Despite this, Bard couldn't help but worry. Jaden was inevitably going to slow them down already, and like him, Bryna didn't have any survival skills or know how to fend for herself. Bard was of the understanding she had been giving some training in the arts of healing from her mother, but he wasn't sure how extensive they were, or even how useful they would be in their situation. If they were overcome by Sakaras, chances were they would all be dead anyway. "She's going to be a burden," Bard thought, "but she's your burden now, so you'll just have to make do. Pull yourself together, Bard. These people need you." New subchapter. Character POV is shifting to Revan, who is another one of the survivors of Jallard under Bard's care. After an arduous day of marching under the hot glare of the sun, Bard finally called for a stop in the afternoon and told Revan, Sidri and Kyra to hunt for something to eat while the rest of them set up camp. It was clear that Kyra and Sidri were still shell-shocked and lacked the resolve The thought that they had even needed to eat had probably not even occurred to them, but it had been ingrained into them from a young age that when Bard gave you an order, it was wise to carry it out. So they reached for their bows and made their way into the woodland. Revan, however, was eager. He welcomed any task he was given. It helped keep his mind away from his grief. Besides, he had not eaten a proper meal for over 2 days and his belly was growling. As he crept silently through the trees with his bow in hand, he began to worry about his friend, though. The three of them had split up, as they were more likely to catch something that way, but Revan realised in hindsight that it may not have been so wise to let Sidri be on his own yet. Since they escaped Jallard, Revan had not left his friend's side once until now. Nothing he did or said consoled him. Revan seemed to be coping much fairer than the others. He was suffering, but not to the same extent they were. He did mourn. He had liked and loved many people from Jallard, and even though he had never been close to his parents, it had been surprisingly heart-wrenching to find them dead. The truth that Revan could barely admit to himself, let alone anyone else, was that a part of him had always craved excitement and adventure, and now, in a very twisted way, his dreams had come true. His quiet beginnings in a humble village were over. He had slain monsters. Most of his friends and family were dead. They were on the run, and he had never felt so alive in his life. After initially worrying if this meant he was heartless, Revan was pushing guilt aside. He was trying to be pragmatic. What happened had been and gone, and most important thing now was the survival of himself and his friends, and to do that he needed to keep his mind in the present. He heard something rustle. He pricked his ears and shifted his head. It was coming from about 20 paces away. A thicket was obstructing whatever it was from view, so Revan crept silently to avoid alerting his prey, knocking an arrow to his bow. But then he heard Sidri's voice. "Dion?" Silent approach was abandoned. Revan rushed to find his friend. Sidri had not spoken much sense over the last 2 days, but why would he call up the name of one of their deceased friends? Had he lost all sanity? Revan caught sight of Sidri's wavy blonde hair between the branches of trees and raced over to him. When he reached him, he saw something else in the clearing which made him question his own sanity. Dion stood before them. "I found you," Dion said. "See, I told you my tracking wasn't that bad." Revan blinked several times, but he was still stood there. "What's going on, guys?" Dion asked. "Chill out, it's me." "I'm sorry, Dion," Revan said as he raised his bow and pointed an arrow at his friend. "But we can't be sure you're not one of them." Dion seemed mildly shocked at first, but then his mouth curved into a smile. "You're skitting me, right?" Revan shook his head grimly. "Chill out, Reeve," Dion said, holding out his open palms. Revan noticed that he wasn't armed and he was still wearing the same clothes from last time they saw him, only blood-stained and torn. "It's me, Dion." "Bryna survived," Sidri whispered. "Dion could have as well." Revan ignored his friend. He was still in trauma. He wasn't capable of making rational decisions. Dion took a step forward. "Stay back," Revan yelled, pulling the arrow back so that it flexed the cord of his bow. "I'm sorry, Dion, but we can't take any chances. Jaden said you were dead." "You're listening to him now? What's wrong with you? You always said he was a useless soddy." Dion smirked. Something didn't quite ring true about that statement coming from Dion. Revan could vividly remember a conversation they once had where Dion admitted that he did not have anything against soddies. "Why would I care what they get up to," he had said as he raised his shoulders. "If they want to hump at each other, it just means there's more girlies for me." They were interrupted by disturbance a few feet away. Revan turned to the source and saw Kyra emerge from the trees. She froze, and her jaw dropped open at the sight of Dion. A small deer cradled in her arms, the prize of her hunt, fell to the ground with a thud. "Kyra?" Dion implored her. "Tell them it's me. You know it's me, right?" "Dion," Kyra whispered. She stared at him as if she could barely believe her eyes. She walked to him. "Kyra!" Revan called. "Stay back, we don't know what he is." But she ignored him and continued walking. "I'm so glad we are alive, Kyra," Dion said as she drew near. Kyra smiled. I thought I'd lost you, Dion said, opening his arms to embrace her. Revan noticed that Kyra was holding a dagger behind her back. Before he had time to shout a warning, there was a flash of steel followed by red. Dion flopped to the ground, flesh hanging out from his throat and blood rushing. Revan raced towards them and grabbed Kyra's wrist. "What the fuck are you doing?" he shouted, forcing back a strong compulsion to hit her across the face. "He's one of them," she yelled. "We didn't know that yet," Revan screamed. She clenched her jaw. He could still see a well of emotions in her eyes, too overwhelming for her to control. A tear welled from one of them and rolled down her cheek. Revan knew Kyra had only done what she thought best, but that could have been the real Dion she just killed. "That wasn't Dion," her voice croaked. I could see it in his eyes. Revan wanted to argue further, but he couldn't find the words. They should have reached a decision together, not brashly acted on gut instinct. Revan?" Sidri said, pointing to the ground behind them. Revan and Kyra both turned and gasped simultaneously. Dion had vanished, and only a patch of blood remained where his body had been. So yeah, that's the extract, and yeah, this is Bloodsworn, and yeah, it can be found on all ebook formats or ordered from Amazon or my publisher. And it's got a sequel coming out next year called Blood Legacy, which is already written, and I'm about to start writing Blood War, the third book. So thank you for listening, and I hope you're having a good convention. Bye-bye.
Next up, we have Kevin Elliott, Lavecon and Elite Dangerous veteran. He's going to be reading his short story, Rock of Sages. Over to you, Kevin.
Hello, welcome. I'm Kevin Elliott. I'm very sorry Lavecon isn't physical this year. Hopefully we'll work out a way to take revenge on the coronavirus. In the meantime, here's my short story, Rock of Sages. Did cooking cabbages create cabbage ghosts? The sweating dinner ladies sacrifice thousands of cabbages in this hall each year to feed the hordes of school children. Now it smelt like the cabbages wanted revenge. The head teacher frowned. He'd ordered fumigation, ventilation, and his staff had ripped up the old linoleum, but the stench remained. Perhaps learning smelt of dead cabbages. He swept through the double doors and into the dining hall. Daylight slunk through the unwashed windows and onto the tiled floor and battered tables. The hall never had enough daylight, and today they'd flicked on the ceiling's fluorescent tubes, which made the stench worse. Sweat greased his neck. He'd need to collar the caretaker about the heating. Science fair day. Pupils had shunted the tables against the hall sides and set up their exhibits before settling back on those dull grey plastic chairs. 40 or 50 teenagers, all pimple and nylon shirt, all staring at him. Some wore hopeful smiles, some scowled at his waistcoat and gown, and a few scuffed their shoes over the floor. Wilkins trotted behind. The head of science tucked a sheaf of scorecards under his sweating arm, and drops of rain glistened on his fogged-up spectacles. The head teacher scanned the hall. Exhibits sat on tables, and 2 or 3 pupils had squeezed behind. Each group had dredged up enough standing boards to hold their gaggle of hand-drawn charts and diagrams. He'd learnt not to expect miracles from 13-year-olds. Head teachers learnt how to hide boredom, so surprises did turn up. Not today, though. He saw model volcanoes shaped from dingy plaster of Paris, batteries concocted from lemons or potatoes, and collections of cogwheels which his pupils would claim to be a model robot, just one they hadn't quite finished. Heat pricked the head teacher's skin. Strange, the hall had been hard to heat. The ceiling impersonated the colander, and windy days often shunted Wilkins's hair into amusing shapes. But now broiling waves of warmth flooded the room. Was this heat radiating from the minor hall, the main hall's extension? The light green folding curtain leading to the minor hall hid something. "What's with the temperature?" Wilkins sniffed. "No, that's Nesbith's minor. His exhibit throws off a little surplus heat. You ought to look, sir." "What's he done? Cranked up the school boiler as a science project?" "Not quite, sir, but—" Wilkins' voice died as a gaggle of junior teachers filtered into the hall. They'd keep everything ticking over while he investigated. Come along, Wilkins. Never leave Nesmith Minor unattended. The folding curtain's steel handle almost burned his fingers, and sweeping back the screen unleashed a near unbreathable wave of heat. He recoiled, but recovered and stepped forward. Nesmith Minor stood beside a massive model volcano. He wore the standard school uniform, blazer, tie, a wrinkled shirt, but his image shimmered in the heat. Why wasn't the boy sweating? Why hadn't he caught fire? This volcano wasn't made of plaster of Paris. No drab uniformity, no damp streaks where pupils had tested their fizzing vinegar mixtures. None of the main hall's volcanoes had been 8 feet tall, none had near black gravels tumbling down their sides, and none belched steam from their tops, and none vomited out those sweltering tsunamis of broiling heat. Your work, Nesmith Minor? Yes, sir. His glowing face glowed with heat. His grinning face glowed with heat. The head teacher stepped sideways. The model volcano sat on 4 of their largest tables, and its top scraped the ceiling. Hissing filled the air, a voice for the sulphurous stench. A glowing crimson rivulet slid over the left-hand side and grew a black crust as it congealed. Smoke trails twisted up from the tables, but they bore the weight, and a set of thick red cables ran from the base and vanished behind a set of wooden cupboards. A model volcano of your design? A few words to entertain his mouth while his mind worked to understand his eyes. Yes, sir. Technically, it's a stratovolcano, alternating layers of tephra and lava flows. A mite more realistic than plaster of Paris. The caretaker hates us adding holes to the ceiling, so I stopped at throwing volcanic bombs. No volcanic bombs? I can start them going if you'd prefer. We're fine without bombs, Nesmith Minor. I doubt our insurance covers volcanic explosions. Ash slipped and spilt over the floor, which began smoking. Another lava stream gushed out, and again caked itself into black rock. Wilkins gasped. The man was adept at gasping, and the head teacher enjoyed having someone around to show emotion. He grasped his waistcoat and stared over his glasses at Nesmith Minor. That's lava dripping from the sides? Molten rock? Yes, sir. Technically it's a felsic lava with a high silica content. The lava stays viscous, so it won't splutter everywhere, and it's molten at 850 degrees, so it don't need much heating. Might I ask where you're finding the power to melt rock? Nesmith Minor smiled. That's where it gets clever, sir. I suspected the school's wiring couldn't handle the required current, so I built a generator. It's in the car park. I took the liberty of drilling a few holes in the school walls. Let's discuss the holes later. Wilkins ran his fingers through his hair. Now is this generator powered, Nesmith Minor? Generators are noisy, whether diesel or electric. Neither diesel nor electric. I went nuclear. Wilkins opened his mouth, but stayed silent. The head teacher dabbed his handkerchief across his head. Your model volcano runs on nuclear fission? No, sir, Nesmith Minor said. People keep squawking about fissile waste products, so I used nuclear fusion. What? Hydrogen nuclei, technically deuterium, a hydrogen isotope with an extra neutron. Bang 2 together and you've extra energy. The head teacher recovered first. The world's top scientists have struggled with fusion for decades, but you've built a working reactor in our car park? Just a small one, sir. Half a car park space. I shoveled in 40 years' worth of deuterium, and it'll power the school for free. Should pay for the wall. You didn't fancy offering the reactor as your science project? There's not much to see, Nesmith Minor said. The reactor looks like a barrel. There's an artificial intelligence handling the quantum tunneling architecture I used to overcome the electrostatic force, but that's not particularly showy. Wilkins sagged a fraction, but took a deep breath and marched towards 2 chairs at the room's far side. He dragged them over, sat in one, and the head teacher took the other. The temperature dropped and a cool breeze touched his cheek. I hope your volcano won't cause trouble. Eruptions are messy. It's only a model, sir. I didn't have time to model any magma chambers. Your work seems exemplary, Nesmith Minor, but praise must be earned, and there are health and safety considerations. Our neighbours may raise concerns over your technology choices. I agree, nuclear fusion is far nicer than fission, but the mere public perception of danger raises its own problems. Can we start with the question of how you assembled the requisite materials to construct a nuclear reactor? Nesmith Minor smiled again, and his lips parted to show a hint of teeth. That's where it gets clever, sir. This isn't the actual school. We're all sitting inside a computer simulation, a multi-threaded sentient database interfaced with a socially aware fractal intelligence. I've programmed heuristic problem-solving techniques to generate a limited form of intelligence in the other teachers and pupils we see here, but we three are the only humans. The nuclear reactor is a simulation and couldn't hurt a fly. You're sure? Oh, yes, sir. You looked a little hot and bothered just now, so I called the room. The head teacher's hands shook. So, we're in a game, a computer game, or something like the Matrix. Nesmith Minor frowned before his grin re-emerged. After a fashion, sir, though it's better than the Matrix. So the dead cabbage stench filling those halls. Real dead cabbages before today, sir. Simulated dead cabbages today. Delete those next time, Wilkins said. The head teacher crossed his legs. But yesterday was real. You're only simulating today. Yes, sir. I wanted to focus on the science fair. The head teacher frowned. I remember going to bed yesterday and waking up this morning. My ablutions, my breakfast, my commute, the entrance to this hall. Can you tell me where the border between reality and simulation lies? The boy smirked and glanced at the ceiling. Tendrils of smoke coiled around the fluorescent tubes. They writhed for a second before vanishing. The head teacher sniffed. Was that ozone? Just clearing the air, sir. About the border, well, that's where it gets clever. Even more clever? I worked out how our physical bodies store human consciousness. It's complicated, but we're having this chat, so I'm sure I've nailed the basics. It's a matter of sweeping up what we might call a soul and storing it inside a simulation. I took the liberty of taking a snapshot of your souls early this morning once you'd both fallen asleep. Now you're free to roam the simulation. I'll return everything to normal once you're asleep tonight. You'll wake up this morning with today's memories. Nesmith Minor paused. You can roam around today, but I'd not recommend leaving Oxford. The rest of the world is sketchy, particularly Whitney. I couldn't get Whitney right at all. The head teacher swallowed and stared at the belching mound of rock and gravel sitting before him. To be clear, you copied our personalities, and now Mr. Wilkins and I are simulated versions of ourselves, sitting a few feet away from a nuclear-powered model volcano with real lava. Yes, sir, I was hoping for extra credit. We'll discuss your academic record later, but one question arises. How has a 14-year-old schoolboy amassed this cornucopia of knowledge? How has he solved technical conundrums which have stumped our finest scientists and philosophers? Ah, that's where it gets clever. I suspected more cleverness. Do tell. I do hope this is the last of these dizzying cycles. The final step is the most powerful technology, sir, as old as the first humans. It's one of the few ways of generating ideas in people's minds. It helps people think in fresh ways, experience events which haven't happened, and it can also demonstrate any technology you can even think of. It's how I built this project. A plume of flame burbled from the volcano's peak, and gravel slipped down the left-hand slope. Our school assemblies use the technology, and so do the chaplain's sermons. Advertisers, salespeople, teachers, even politicians dabble. You'd better tell us before things get too clever. We're in a story, sir, and we're being read. What? We're characters in a book. Someone is sitting at a word processor or typewriter, or they're flourishing a fountain pen. They had an idea. They wrote a first draft and refined it. Hopefully people will see the final polished version. So you wrote the story? No, sir. I'm just a character, as are you and Mr. Wilkins. I've no idea who the author is or where it's been published, but the story brings life to the author's concepts. Perhaps that's the author's point, to have people consider inventions before they're invented. Perhaps an inventor will read the story and have a goal to work towards. I don't think characters are meant to know their author's plans, but there's no harm in guessing. So the author wants to prepare society for its journey to the future. Maybe they just enjoy writing, sir. Maybe they just wanted to enter a competition, or they needed a story for a presentation. You should ask the author. The head teacher ran his hands through his hair. Was it thinning? So, what happens when the story ends? I'm not really sure, the Smith Minor said. Okay, that's the story's end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more of my writing, you can visit my blog at kevinelliott.space or search for Where's My Flipping Tea. Click on the logo you'll see there to sign up for a free copy of my short stories. The collection's called Go When the Light Turns Red. The collection is also available on Amazon, as is my novel, Lightmaker. I'd love you to read either or both of those works, and reviews would be absolute heaven. Hoping to see you at next year's physical Lavecon when we stamp the coronavirus, and maybe at FantasyCon later in the year. Thanks very much.
Hello, Lavecon. Okay. The last reading for this evening is from me. This is chapter 1 of my new novel, Resilient. This is due to be published in spring 2022 by Flame Tree Press. It's the sequel to Fearless, which was my 2020 novel, which you may remember was due to be launched at Lavecon 2020. I did do a little reading from it in the author readings last year, and the reading I'm going to give you tonight, well, it is from the first chapter. It doesn't spoil anything, so it should be okay. So if you haven't read Fearless, you haven't picked it up yet, then that's totally fine. This won't spoil your enjoyment of it. So yes, this is chapter 1, and it follows on from the story of the first book. They are a continuous story, but as I say, this particular section won't spoil some of the stuff from the previous episode in the series. Okay, enjoy. Chapter 1, Holder. Name and employee ID, please. I sigh, wipe my sweaty forehead with the back of my arm and hold up my badge right in front of the camera. The guy on the screen leans forward, squinting at it. Sorry, I can't read that. Can you tell me where you're from? Natalie Holder. Amalgamated Solutions? There's a delay. Latency on the connection to his remote access somewhere else in the world. The guy glances down at some paperwork in front of him. Yeah, okay. I have you. Employee ID, please. AK667AB1E8. The same pause. Great. Yes, that's fine. He looks up at me again. You been here before? No, it's my first time. All right, before you go through, the regs state I need to advise you to make sure you're hydrated and that you have supplies. The hub is one of the least hospitable places on Earth. Your pass entitles you to a 2-hour stay, but after that, it'll expire. And if you stay on premises for too long, you will too. Sure, understood. Great, then let's get you moving. A beam lances out from beneath the screen, bathing me in red light. I hold my breath, expecting the worst, but the worst doesn't come. Instead, the scan completes, and a buzzer sounds. The door in front of me unlocks and starts to swing open. I'm keen to get moving, but I don't touch the moving panel. The last thing I want is an unnecessary attention. These people need to think that I'm legit. I need to do my part. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm through the door and inside. The temperature is a couple of degrees cooler here, 42 Celsius, as opposed to 44 or 45. I can feel the heat coming off the painted concrete walls. It's like an assault, all targeted at me being the only person here. Out in the middle of nowhere, at the entrance to the 8th wonder of the world. The Atacama Desert in the former Republic of Chile is home to the largest tile farm on Earth. The reflective glow from the massive solar array can be seen from space, even as far as the lunar colony at times. The accompanying underground hydro battery and distribution network make this one of the most sensitive. The reflective glow from the massive solar array can be seen from space, even as far as the lunar colony at times. The accompanying underground hydro battery and distribution network make this one of the most sensitive facilities on the planet. It's also unstaffed. The whole complex is unsafe for human habitation, owing to the extreme heat generated by the system. Rather than waste the money on expensive coolant processes, everything's been designed to tolerate fierce temperatures. The technology in here is the same as the stuff they use on Ceres in the asteroid mining stations. 7,000 multinational corporations rely on these arrays for their day-to-day electricity. Supply companies beneath them pay regular rates for their power, and beneath them are 8 billion individual citizens of Earth. The whole system is a corporate control web. 200 years ago, who would have thought access to electricity would become the way the powerful keep the rest of us in line? According to the schematic I've seen, mobile autonomous security units patrol the interior. They're maintained and monitored by different commercial contractors across the globe. Each of them has a territory. Whilst I stay on the authorised route for my visit, they won't be a problem. As soon as I'm detected deviating, the nearest unit will be tasked to intercept me, but there's latency there too. I'll have a few seconds. So when I make my move, I need to do it carefully and fast. I start down the path. I grew up in Nigeria, so the heat is something I can tolerate, but the reflection of light bouncing off all the tiles is like looking at the sun in all directions. 3 steps in the brightness is hurting my eyes. I have no choice but to keep my gaze fixed on my feet and the scoured gravel underfoot. The instructions specified the distance I need to walk in meters, so I've been practicing to keep my stride in a regular pattern. However, now I'm here, I can't help but worry that I've misstepped in some way and that I'll end up lost. 16 meters to the first turn. Go right. I make the turn. Any outward sign of hesitation might be observed, so I can't second guess myself or the directions. 8 meters, then left. 12 meters, then right again. 4 meters, then you're there. There's just shadow over the ground where I stop as instructed. I glance to my left and see the control panel, the reason I'm supposed to be here according to the authorities. I kneel down in front of it. The location is a small blind spot in the camera coverage. I'm expected to be here, to work on the system using the panel, diagnose the error that was detected, and apply a bespoke software patch. So there's no need for the security monitoring to be alerted to a deviation. Not for a while. My gaze falls to the metal section beneath the control panel. There's a ventilation grill big enough to fit through. Behind it should be a powerful electrical fan. I reach out and brush my fingers against the metal, but there's no breeze. Either the fan is switched off, or... I take out my powered screwdriver, fit the correct socket and start undoing the bolts. There's 8 of them, but they come away pretty easily, and the grill lifts off without resistance. Underneath there's no fan, but an open space in darkness out of the sun. I sit on the ground and lower myself in. About 3 feet below, my boots meet a step, then another immediately below that. I turn around and begin climbing down into the darkness. 6 or 7 steps down and my eyes begin to adjust. I'm in a concrete box. The shadows of objects clutter the floor. I take out a small pen torch and carefully flick it on. The extractor unit has been disassembled and left here in a pile, just as they said it would be. The chamber has been excavated too. There's a hole at the far wall where someone's managed to break through to the next room. I step off the ladder and walk towards the hole. I shine my torch into the empty space. If I crouch and get on my hands and knees, I'll be able to get in here, but I need to be careful. The equipment I'm carrying is fragile. Very fragile. I crawl into the hole, shuffling over broken stones and mud. It's much cooler down here, where the sunlight can't reach. I'm shivering a little. Maybe I got too used to the blazing heat outside. Well, it'll be hot enough in here soon enough. The tunnel ends abruptly. I have to trust we're in the right place. Out had a job to do, just like me. I turn and lie flat on my back in the dark. The little pen torch has a corded loop. I drape it over a hanging rock. It illuminates the space above me so I can see my hands and work. The 3 containers I've been given are in my pockets. I pull them out and connect them together as I was shown. The device is a reaction explosive, powerful enough to obliterate me and everything around me in a 2-kilometre radius once it's activated. The tunnel is right above an underground regulator too. Once I press the ignition switch, this whole place will be wrecked. The damage will be catastrophic. Everything has been carefully arranged. That's how it works. You fail when you try to overcomplicate your job. So instead, everyone does a part. The security clearance was forged. The security scanner was hacked. The ventilation system removed. The hole dug. All of it planned, patiently, and put together over months by different people. I'm the last piece of the puzzle. My hands are shaking either from the cold or from nerves. I take a moment, steady my breathing. These will be my last minutes alive. I have a purpose. I always wanted a purpose. This is my purpose. This is what I was put here to do, so others can live better and break the chains of slavery. I am what they used to call a martyr, a sacrifice to the cause. The tears come then, and the sobs. Great body-racking heaves that make me feel sick and wretch. I try to fight them in the enclosed space, clinging desperately to the tube in my hands, this little 3-section thing that is the key to humanity's future. Then I go calm. They tell you this when you train. There's a moment of acceptance, a moment when everything becomes clear. The world becomes small, and nothing matters apart from you and the trigger. You and the bomb. That's the moment you have to seize. Otherwise you panic, and it all goes to shit. I press the trigger. There we go, Lavecon attendees. That's the end of the author readings for this evening. If you'd like to check out any of the authors that you've heard from today, then you'll be able to find them online, and we'll certainly be posting up links to some of their work. Take care for this evening, and enjoy the rest of the convention.